More case studies with globalization before we move on to some of the responses. Brazil is the next example I want to move on to. Whoops. So Brazil is a, there we go. Brazil is a good example of a country that still has a pretty significant gap between the rich and the poor, although you do see a significant growth in the middle class in Brazil. As you can see, it now makes up the majority of the population. Um, its economy is mainly dominated by agribusiness, so food production, as well as various elements of the steel industry, as well as other types of metal products. So ores we see here, iron, steel, right? So still, most of the exports coming out of Brazil are in those two industries, right? In terms of continued economic inequality, we see that the urban poor still live in very dire conditions. It is not uncommon at all to see that in urban areas, the majority of the poor live in what are called favelas, which are shanty towns. And this is an image of a favela on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, right? You do see some significant signs of at least some economic growth in Brazil, the growth in economic or government spending, for example, on things like unemployment insurance. The unemployment rate did start to fall in Brazil, although we see it climbing precipitously over the past couple of years. Right, wages have also experienced a drop. So the current state of Brazil's economy is that it has been experiencing a large-scale recession. This was very problematic, of course, when we debated whether the Olympics would still be a good location in Rio de Janeiro in 2016, and also, of course, there has been a major public health crisis with the Zika virus in this part of the world. So Brazil is an interesting example of how globalization has contributed to some growth in the economy among people who control industries, right? So the middle class is made up, mainly of management, right? So if you are the boss of something like the agribusiness industry, you're still doing fine, right? But if you are among the working class, you are doing very, very poorly in a place like Brazil. And Russia is another very good example of a huge gap between the rich and the poor. Russia was largely dominated by the oil industry, both before and after the Cold War was over. And at the end of the Cold War, the oil wealth was very much just tied to the economy as a whole. So what you would see is that if the price of oil stayed high, the economy was strong. But when it dropped, the economy declined rapidly. And in the early 2000s, when oil prices started to drop, you saw unemployment and the homeless population just skyrocket. You can see in general that the GDP did grow, however, leading into the beginning of the 21st century. But one of the problems, though, is that this GDP does not impact everyone equally, right? The GDP is not a reflection of the gap between the rich and the poor. So in the early 1990s, people that benefited from the oil-rich economy, people, again, that managed that part of the economy, were actually starting to enter into a new elite class, right? Communist Soviet Russia was at least meant to be a classless society, right? But in the early 90s, you started to see the increasing presence of luxury car dealerships and fashion, high fashion luxury boutiques in countries or in cities like Moscow. So that showed us that the wealthier classes in Russia were getting more accustomed to luxury goods and prosperity, right? So now, today, Russia has the most unequal distribution of wealth in the entire world. The top 1% of the population holds almost 3/4 of the nation's wealth. And I just wanted to show, the dichotomy. I was having trouble finding, interesting photos of the rich and famous in Russia. And what I came across is actually interesting. There's this fascination with the wealthy Russian teens. I guess it's a popular topic in BuzzFeed and such. And so I saw this image of this is a teenage Russian boy posing in front of his Lamborghini in front of a Eastern Orthodox church. And then here you see very, very poor Russians in a less than wealthy looking urban landscape, right? So in general, what we see is that there is a very significant gap that is only really perpetuating. Okay, so how does imperialism, sorry, how does globalization actually take shape? How is it actually administered by different organizations? In general, after actually starting with the end of World War II, there was an attempt to actually establish organizations that would help regulate, and in most instances, actually deregulate international trade. And so the first organization, the first international trade organization that was founded was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is abbreviated GATT, and it was founded in 1947. And what it did was it lifted restrictive barriers to trade. So it lowered and, in certain circumstances, eliminated tariffs, and that promoted more international trade and helped restore economic prosperity to war-ravaged nations. By the 1990s, the average tariff rates had sunk to below 5%, which eased the movement of goods across national borders, right? So in general, what GATT did was it expanded and promoted what it considered to be free trade, right? The GATT was taken over by the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, in 1995. The WTO makes rules that govern more than 90% of all international trade. And this is actually a pretty controversial organization, partly because its meetings are closed to the public and board members represent mostly corporate interests. And so rules tended to favor rules tended to favor trade over other considerations like moral issues or, ethical treatment of workers and so on. One good example is that a member nation that refused to purchase clothing made from sweatshop labor actually could be sanctioned by the WTO. So the WTO is seen as a promoter of free trade, but its critics argue that free trade and fair trade are not the same thing. We'll get back to that actually right now. And that's one of the biggest examples of resistance to globalization. Many people argue that free trade and fair trade are not the same thing, right? That free trade actually can exploit, again, low cost of labor in certain countries, less environmental regulation in certain countries. So free trade is something that doesn't necessarily benefit the working class. People also argue that international trade organizations like the WTO support corporations more than the rights of workers, environmental impacts, and of course small businesses as well. It's very difficult for them to survive when the WTO mainly has the interests of corporations in mind. Also, developing nations are major critics of the WTO because they say that their economies cannot grow properly when their businesses have to compete with established corporations from the developed world. And one of the best examples of, this just general resistance and opposition to globalization was the 1999, what is called the Battle for Seattle, which was large-scale protests outside of the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. The meeting actually was shut down eventually by a variety of interest groups, including labor unions, environmental groups, and family farmers. The protest did not force the WTO to change its rules or to become a more inclusive organization. But what the protest did do was it brought more issues at the heart of the new global economy to the world's attention. So just the fact that this was a widely publicized event gave us a sense that the WTO, in many people's minds, was promoting, again, free trade, but not necessarily fair trade. Okay, two more slides. No, a few more than two more slides. I lied. Okay, technology also plays a major role in how we see different parts of the world. Globalization plus advances in telecommunications technology really makes the world feel smaller. And that is largely a result of the internet itself. So the internet was actually first developed for the U.S. Defense Department during the Cold War, but by the late 1990s, it became a regular tool of communication for the public. And you guys all, since you're about 15 years younger than I am at this point, you guys have never really known a world that hasn't had the internet and hasn't had this instantaneous access to information and communication. So now that communication is easier, information is more abundant and accessible than ever before. But of course, one of the problems that goes along with this access to information is it's more difficult to really filter out the information that's accurate and accountable from the information that's not. And so technology has a really significant impact on our awareness of social issues and political problems, right? The fact that information is more easy for us to access anywhere at any time makes us, I guess, have to question the accountability of this information. So, videos taken, for example, on people's cell phones of police brutality, they spark outrage. They raise inquiries into racial profiling, riots against injustices perceived in the justice system. But, one of the things that I guess we have to increasingly question is, ultimately, what we see and what we don't see. Ultimately, how the recording of a certain act of injustice may actually potentially skew our perception of that event, right? How oftentimes organizations deliberately try to reshape the way that we perceive given events. Of course, one of the things that's sticking out in my mind right now is the very recent instance of the United Airlines overbooking a flight, and on camera we saw one passenger getting dragged off the flight. One of the things you notice, of course, is that this incident was highly publicized because so many other passengers on the plane had smartphones and they were recording it, right? So we have to ask the question: are we actually, increasingly aware of instances of violence, crime, police brutality, things like that? Because with the increase in communication technology, we can filter those events. Okay, so let's talk about the Arab Spring, because I think this is actually a really good example of how again, the internet and instantaneous communication can actually even shape history and shape politics. Right, so the Arab Spring is, or it was, a series of popular uprisings in many Arab countries. And ultimately, it started actually in a lot of ways because a particular incident was shared on social media, right? So in 2010, a man in Tunisia set himself on fire in protest after the police confiscated his fruit stand. And the videos of the protests that followed this were shared on Facebook, and it showed the story to millions of people who would not have learned about it if it went through traditional or official news channels. Social media's effect on policy and politics was felt even more clearly when in Egypt, protests against the regime of President Hosni Mubarak erupted in Cairo and other Egyptian cities in January of 2011. Many of these protests were actually organized through social media, and a month after the protest started, Mubarak stepped down and handed power to his vice president. So in this instance, we could actually argue that the ousting of an unpopular political leader started because of new information technology and new communication methods. In Iran, in February of 2011, thousands of people, prompted by messages on social media, went to the streets and protested, which is very rare in Iran, against the government. And uprisings during the Arab Spring in general just really reveal the power of new social media technologies. Okay, very last slide here, all pictures. But in general, it's also just important for us to realize how globalization impacts our culture. And this, in a lot of ways, is a little bit more heavy from the American perspective, but it certainly impacts us as well. So in the early 21st century, multi-billion-dollar corporations were really at the forefront of global trade because they could afford to advertise and distribute their products. So people around the world became familiar with global brands such as Apple, Nike, Rolex, and American celebrities started to become global superstars. So athletes like Yao Ming from China or LeBron James from Cleveland, I think. Sorry, I don't know anything about basketball. Don't hate me. Were really, global figures. They were known everywhere. I know this firsthand because when I went to visit China, they all wanted to know, they wanted to talk about athletes. They wanted to talk about the newest pop stars. And I just wanted to, demonstrate how we see representations of, American global icons shown all the way across the world, right? which gives us a sense of their popularity. This is actually a magazine cover that's highlighting Madonna's tour in Japan. Uh, Also, we see that there's a diversification of the global marketplace, and again, this is not just coming from the West. So, a good example would be how Americans have increasing access to. It seems like the American youth tends to really be fixated on a lot of products that come from Japan. So, and this started when I was a kid. I think about the fact that our favorite, at least our favorite video game console when I was a kid was Nintendo, which of course is a Japanese company. We now, of course, see the influx. This is more of a thing among younger girls, I guess, but the ubiquitousness of things like Hello Kitty or anime, or of course the Pokemon Go craze last summer. Right, the idea was these were all products that were accessible to us that were originally manufactured across the world. The United States still tends to be the dominant transmitter of culture around the world, but again, I just really wanted to highlight things like Hello Kitty, Pokemon, because it doesn't only go one way. But in general, we do see a pretty significant Americanization of popular culture. There's more knowledge of Americans than American knowledge of the rest of the world. So we see, Coca-Cola products and Starbucks, McDonald's, accessible virtually everywhere. English language also is brought more to global markets, but not vice versa. So this imbalance has created some resentment among those who felt that American popular culture has diluted their own unique cultural identity. And we also see globalization evidenced in sports. There has been a growing viewership of the Olympic Games. So in the year 2000, for example, there were nearly 2 million people that turned on their televisions and watched the Olympic Games. Also, the World Cup soccer shows us globalization. There's been a massive global audience. Apparently, 350 million viewers tuned in to watch the World Cup in 2014. And also, we even see a globalization of religion. So there's been a growth of New Age religions in Western cultures like Buddhism, Shamanism, Sufism, Hinduism. Back during the Beatles craze, even in the 1960s. George Harrison went to India, and when he came back, he had learned how to play the sitar, and he also introduced songs that had Hindu mantras in them to popularize them among Western audiences. And I also think about, the increasing instance of globalization in other forms of popular culture, sort of in an athletic venue. You all know that I'm a big yoga practitioner and instructor. That obviously is something that is not indigenous to the Americas. The growth of things like jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, and so on are also good examples of globalization of a type of sports culture. So in general, the important part of us to think about when we step away from globalization and think about just this year, we can consider how much smaller the world has gotten from the beginning of our study in AP World History to now at the end, right? Think about all the different instances. In a lot of ways, this is a good demonstrator of continuity and change. Oftentimes, the AP examiners like to look at trends in the economy, how things have changed. We tend to focus a lot on the age of exploration, sort of the 15th through 18th centuries, as a major time when global trade increased. But of course, we cannot forget how this increase expands even further when we get into the 21st century. So that is the very last video of the year, guys. It's been awesome recording all these for you. I really hope they come in handy when you're preparing for the AP exam. For those of you in my class and beyond, best of luck on your AP exam. And that's all, folks.